Are we about ready, Anastasia?
Yes, we're online.
Okay. Should I start?
Yeah, you can start, please.
Okay. So, hi everyone. I'm Jeremy Siegel, coming to you from New York City, where we are still in quarantine. So I'm coming to you from my home in Brooklyn Heights, a few minutes away from our office in Dumbo. And I'm happy to be able to speak to you virtually today for this CANactions online talk. Would have been nice to do in person, but this is fun too. I think the way that the city has been recently, this whole quarantine thing is, of course, it's challenging, but it's also exciting for us as urban designers. And like many of the projects I'll share with you today, I think these kind of crisis moments are always an important moment for cities and give us a chance to rethink and kind of reset. So to get into it, the talk today is going to be called Social Infrastructure for NYC. I've been here in the New York City office for about 10 years since we opened in 2010. I've worked on a range of projects, but for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been focusing on our kind of urban landscape infrastructure planning work. A lot of that has been in our own backyard here. So a subtitle for the talk, let's see, is also Trolling Robert Moses. Robert Moses, for those of you who aren't familiar, was one of the kind of most seminal figures in New York City planning for most of the 20th century. He kind of had or created for himself almost singular power and built all of the highways, public housing projects, major complexes like Lincoln Center or the World Expo site. So really shaped New York in the kind of 20th century model, which had its own set of values. And I think through the infrastructure work that we've been doing, we're constantly finding ourselves sort of bumping up against those values, being able to question them and finding ways to rethink some of the mistakes that we made in the 20th century and kind of work towards a new set of values. So Robert Moses kind of keeps coming up over and over again. You'll see through the projects. And it's been kind of fun to have that dialogue in a way through history. The kind of planning that Robert Moses and much of the 20th century produced, of course, led to a whole lot of economic growth, a whole lot of course, housing of population, but it also exposed us to vulnerabilities that we deal with today. So the coastal highways and the land reclamation that were completed in New York City over the last decades and centuries are exactly those things that today expose us to the kind of climate risks that we saw with Hurricane Sandy. And so in our infrastructure work, or what we call social infrastructure, we're also always finding that there are ways to sort of deal with both urban issues, or let's say social issues, and these more sort of pressing infrastructural issues, and to do them at the same time in a single package. For those who aren't familiar, just start with a little bit about BIG and kind of how we got here to New York and where we came from. BIG is an office today of about 600 people, 250 here in New York, 250 in Copenhagen. We also have offices in London and Barcelona right now. But for those of you who have been following us and Bjarke for a while, you'll know that we work at a whole range of scales, from sort of product design to buildings, landscapes, public spaces, and also planning both at the urban scale and even at the regional scale. And I think since the beginning of the firm, there's always been this kind of interest in looking at problems holistically, looking at all the different issues that can impact a single site or a single building, and really trying to find synergies between different considerations. In Copenhagen, I think the office has also had the chance to sort of build off of the really communal and social ethos when it comes to public space that exists in Denmark. So early projects like the harbor bath were really kind of celebrating the environmental progress of a cleaner harbor and bringing people out to it for recreation. Even projects like the VM house or the mountain, where sort of middle income housing was looked at in a way that great variety and sort of individuality could be accommodated or expressed in layouts and in apartment variety. The public spaces or semi-public spaces, let's say, even within a building, really express and accommodate sort of the individual or the family unit. Projects like the 8 House, which really bring urban life up into the building, here as a 3-dimensional street, where a real strong sense of community is created in what might otherwise be a more kind of sterile or generic housing block. Projects like Superkielen, where a disused railway line was to be converted into a park in one of the most diverse neighborhoods of Copenhagen, Nørrebro. And so the strategy was taken to sort of divide the site up into a series of zones, but within those zones, work with the really diverse, more than 100 nationalities that live in the area, and actually crowdsource urban furnishing so that benches, lighting, signs, sort of bike posts, playground equipment, all these things end up representing a more diverse constituency than one might normally associate with a Danish park. So fountains from Morocco, palm trees from China, signs from Russia, and so on. And then this has kind of scaled up in recent years. This was a competition that was actually won, I think, when we first started in New York in 2010, and it was just completed this year. This is Copenhill, where we were invited to build or basically beautify a forthcoming waste-to-energy plant that would be processing most of Copenhagen's trash. And I think this is a really clear example of this idea of social infrastructure, where what would normally be sort of a blight on the city was turned into an opportunity, and the city was really invited to participate in the processes of the plant. So a ski slope here is placed on top with a black, a blue, and a green slope, and it's become an all-weather, all-season skiing and snowboarding destination for Denmark, which of course has snow, but no mountains, including also the world's tallest climbing wall. Just adjacent to Copenhill, we've been working on sort of floating affordable housing for students with the urban rigor, where a series of shipping containers are prefabricated at shipyards in Poland or in China, towed into place, and through photovoltaics, seawater cooling, and wind capture are creating very sustainable and also very affordable. These are about 750,000 US dollars per rigger, which each have about 12 units. Construction cost, so quite affordable, but also incredibly high quality in terms of the living spaces. And this is being scaled up within Copenhagen now, where a series are being built. So, you know, I think that this kind of testing ground of Denmark, where sort of communal ethos and public space are really valued and are able to be executed has been a good background for us as we've entered New York City, where it's been a little bit more of an uphill battle, but it's also been kind of fertile ground for yeah, real innovation, I would say, in rethinking the way the city and the way in this country infrastructure is built. So the first project I'm going to share for New York City was conceived in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. It deals with climate change as its primary challenge, and it's called the Big U. So the competition was conceived in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, where we realized that the hurricane belt, which traditionally has been more in the equatorial region, has been expanding northward. And this means that hurricane tracks in the last few decades are increasingly coming further and further north. So the Northeast megaregion, which has tens of millions of people in it, and hasn't really been designed to take on these kinds of hurricanes, is more and more having to deal with them. This is the track that Superstorm Sandy took in 2012. Its impact on Washington, D.C., New Jersey, New York, which you can see here, and Boston further north. And then in New York City itself, the kind of the configuration of the coastline we call the New York Bight really channels Atlantic storm surge into this 90-degree funnel, as well as having storm surge come from the Long Island Sound. So it really puts a huge amount of the city at risk, just about 50% of the city's developed area. During Hurricane Sandy, we saw about $20 billion worth of damage within the New York metro area. Physical damage to our infrastructure, private property, public property, but also to our economy and to our social fabric. Both during the day and at night, you can see really the dramatic kind of change here, where the city was shut down for weeks. And there's still, particularly in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, the Rockaways, Staten Island, there are still public housing projects which have not yet recovered. There are subway tunnels which have not yet recovered. So really a big issue for New York. So in the wake of this, President Obama and the HUD secretary at the time, Sean Donovan, decided that they would hold a design competition that would take a portion, $1 billion of the $50 billion that was appropriated for Hurricane Sandy recovery, and put it towards a competition that would be geared not towards building back what there was before, but building back better. This was administered by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and that was done in partnership with a number of local nonprofits. So the 10 teams that entered all sort of had different focuses. The 10 teams that were selected, I should say, out of the first stage of the competition, where there were about 160 entries. And our focus was really high density urban places centered in New York City. And our work kind of started with this area that was dubbed SOPO after the event, south of Power, where basically south of 34th Street is everything that went dark when the 14th Street substation blew. And that's that shot that Ewan Bond captured from his helicopter ride. And if you look at that same area, you'll see that essentially it started in the 17th century with the Dutch and then the British, who began a program of land reclamation, which concentrated land towards the harbor for economic development and industrial activities. But about 50% of the land area now, that same profile, is now at about 6 feet above mean sea level, which means that it is today our floodplain. So this is the 2050, 100-year floodplain for New York City. North of that, you get sort of high cliffs. But really, this area is where all the land reclamation took place in the marshes, and that's why it's at risk today. So the Big U really started with just the identification of this geography. as a place with a lot of risk and also a lot of exposure, given that there's so much density of kind of cultural, economic, and other assets here. The city had been looking at some kind of flood protection for this area, but what our big worry was is that given the way that infrastructure is typically built, usually it originates from the engineering or the government sector. And this means that it usually is sort of directed towards a single purpose. And for us, the construction of 10 miles of flood protection infrastructure around New York City would be a disaster of another kind if it resulted in a kind of uniform solution that was purely engineered and that would serve to cut off the waterfront from the city. So the High Line, of course, we all know has this often referenced project, but it's a pretty clear example of a kind of recreational or social program being hybridized with a piece of infrastructure in a very narrow footprint. In this case, as a retroactive measure, the train viaduct that the High Line was built on was decommissioned before it became a park. So our question was, can we do this as a proactive thing? Can we build flood protection infrastructure that works at the same time for people, for waterfront programs, and that responds to the diversity of the people and neighborhoods that you find along a waterfront like Lower Manhattan's. So sort of working with that scale of the neighborhood, we also started to look at the scale of the hydrology. And, to do 10 miles, which is the total length, that's about what, 20 kilometers, of flood protection infrastructure would be hugely costly, hugely difficult from a financial point of view, from a political point of view, just to get everyone aligned. And so the notion of being able to build up this U in smaller pieces became a really important aspect to the strategy. So we realized that we could build it as a series of little U's almost that would respond to the different kind of high points along the waterfront where it's easier to go upland. So like the hull of a ship, where you don't have just a single shell, but you actually have a series of compartments. This meant that we could actually build Big U in pieces, and that each of those pieces could sort of be financed independently, administrated independently, but also designed independently in conjunction with the communities that lie upland, and really respond in a more granular way to the city. So sort of both unified, but also diverse. And at the time, we sort of thought of this as, the result of a Robert Moses sort of scale move, but with a Jane Jacobs sort of sensitivity of implementation, or as Björk loved to say, the love child of the two. You can say the collaboration as well. But from a design point of view, what that meant is that we had to get to a particular elevation. So this essentially meant that we had to build a wall. Now I talked about that 6 foot above mean sea level number. This is about average sea level here. So this is sort of average ground level around New York City. To get to the same frequency storm as Hurricane Sandy, which was a 100-year storm, but also account for sea level rise to the year 2050 or 2100, we have to go to about 16 feet, which is a significant intervention. So our question was, how can we kind of hybridize this with other programs and make it anything but a wall? But to do that, we realized that we would need to speak with the people who would be using the waterfront most. So, I would say this is where we really departed from our typical toolkit as designers and sort of waded into the world of New York City community politics and government. So we became acquainted with the kind of governance system for New York City, which is organized into community boards, which are very powerful and have the ability to deny or approve projects. US Congress members, state assembly members, state senators, as well as the community groups. So the Lower East Side is actually has one of the most densities of community organizations in the country. It's one of the most well-organized neighborhoods. It probably is the most well-organized neighborhood in the country. So these groups have a long history and have a huge amount of intelligence about these waterfronts. And we realized really quickly that it would be important to team up with them. Another consideration which worked in our favor is that most of Manhattan's waterfront is actually publicly owned, which means that New York City government would be able to actually execute flood protection on its own property. And that was a consideration in terms of where we would go for a natural pilot. So these are all the stakeholders that we worked with in that first year-long process in 2013 and 14, working with the federal level, the state level, the city level, community civic, as well as businesses, through hundreds of meetings, briefings, workshops, you name it. And slowly we kind of began to zero in on the east side as a place where both risk but also opportunity really coalesced. So on the Lower East Side, you have 130,000 residents, 86,000 of whom are low income, elderly, or disabled. They live in 30,000 public housing units, which is one of the single biggest concentration of public housing in Manhattan. The area of the floodplain here is very deep because this whole area used to be marshland. So it's 600 acres, 75 city blocks, notably no subway stations. This is an area that, due to its public housing, is extremely underserved, both by transit, but also other public services. Notably, it has the power plant as well, which blew during Hurricane Sandy, and that caused everything south of 34th Street to go dark. And it has 3 miles of waterfront that have actually been super underinvested in, basically in the last half century or more, while other parts of the city, like the West Side, Brooklyn, and others, have had a lot more investment recently. So we teamed up with a group called Lower East Side Ready, which was an umbrella group for, at the time, about 40 member organizations. I think it's more like 80 now. So it was really kind of a one-stop shop for everyone that had a stake and a say in this neighborhood. We started joining their weekly meetings, and their focus was really on kind of short-term recovery. And we were able to add kind of a more medium and long-term dimension to those considerations. We teamed up as well with the chair of Lower East Side Ready and a good friend of ours now, Damaris Reyes, who is really a big voice in the neighborhood, put together a planning group. And not really knowing what to do, we decided to just sort of take the process that we use in our office and bring it out into the community. And for us, one of the most important tools to build consensus within the office and to make design decisions is the physical model as something that is concrete, that everybody is looking at the same thing, and there's less sort of risk of misinterpretation. So what we did is we built sort of a suite of options, from very basic engineered options to things that would accommodate simple bike paths and seating, to more heavy infrastructure moves. We talked with the community about the different sort of engineering considerations for different kinds of flood protection. A temporary barrier is, of course, the least disruptive to the urban fabric, but it actually carries 5 magnitudes more risk than more passive permanent flood protection infrastructures like flood walls or earthen levees. We held a series of workshops, public workshops, which have continued to this day. These were our first two on the Lower East Side in 2013. My God, which is 7 years ago. And we really sort of brought all the options out, and people were just so engaged being able to use these tools and really wrap their heads around issues that I think planners, particularly in New York City and America, but I'm sure it happens everywhere. I think there's a tendency with planning to sort of be more vague, to work with highlighters and post-it notes and sort of more vague ambitions. I think one thing that we bring to these discussions as designers and as architects is just a compulsion to be concrete about what we're talking about. And in a lot of ways, I think that translates into a heightened feeling of transparency and clarity with the communities that we work with. And it's something that we try and bring to all of our projects. But to get back to the Big U, we, by the end of that first process, ended up looking at a focus scope of 4.25 miles from 23rd Street all the way down to the Battery, split into 3 compartments: Lower East Side, Two Bridges, Chinatown, and the Financial District. We recently, oh, sorry, hold on. Okay. All right. So recently, in 2015, we began work on the first phase of this, which is the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project. The East Side Coastal Resiliency Project runs from East 23rd Street down to Montgomery Street. It is 2.25 miles of flood protection, which received $335 million from the federal government at the end of this Rebuild by Design competition. Since then, the City of New York basically took on the administration of the project, and we've been working with the City of New York since 2015 on this stretch. And this stretch is really about taking a park, which is East River Park here, and elevating it literally and figuratively by creating a flood protection which completely rethinks the urban fabric connections over the highway, creates better connections. We're building 3 new bridges, and that's going to create 60 new acres of parkland for this community while creating a storm surge barrier. You can see here the connections towards the water, the sort of topography and the Manhattan Greenway here. New amphitheaters that will be, and lawns that will be tied to the new bridging connections, which would be wider and more generous. Sort of taking areas where today you're met with fencing and really pushing fields apart and bringing the park right up to the water. Working with very simple buildings. So this is going to be a really robustly detailed public project where we need to work with New York City park standards. So, we were essentially given a palette of glazed tiles, for example, that we could use for the comfort stations in the park. And we said, okay, great, we'll use all of them. So we have kind of a subtle wayfinding that happens throughout the park as you move from the south with cooler colors to the middle of the park, which is more of a range for the track house here, which has locker rooms, administrative spaces, etc. And then warmer colors to the north of the park with a brick pattern that also works with the existing brick buildings. And really trying to bring those bridging connections into the neighborhood. So that where today a bridge entry is actually hidden behind this building here, bridge connections are really intuitive and obvious. As we move north, there are other conditions that we deal with. So here in Stuyvesant Cove Park, really a kind of narrower condition. And Solar One is actually going to be the first likely piece of the Big U that gets built. This is an environmental education center where an existing facility, which is a simple shed with a solar roof on top, is going to be replaced due to the flood protection work. So we've actually been able to redesign that facility as a kind of a continuous public surface so that classes and groups of kids can be taken up to see the solar roof. And then inside, there is environmental education space. Then you can see here the phasing so that the building will actually be built first, and then the berm will be built around it. So all in all, it's 60 acres here with what we call the park archipelago. So the plan of the park is really organized to preserve a lot of the active recreation that already happens in the park, so baseball field, soccer field, etc., but then kind of shrink wrapped with green public space and better connections across. This is that full scope from 23rd Street down to Montclair. And then if this works, we couldn't help but put the Game of Thrones soundtrack on it. But this gives you a quick sort of run through of that stretch. So that's the first of the bridges, the Lower East Side Ecology Center and its nature play, the Delancey Street Bridge here. So all of this park today is very flat and super underinvested in. And we're really going to be raising and rebuilding the entirety of the park, preserving its programs and uses, which we've heard from the community are super important, but trying to infuse other programs with it. Okay. So I'm going to take you on a little side journey here with a guerrilla project that resulted from the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project that I just showed you a little detour, where stormwater was essentially a big issue that had to be dealt with. So you have both storm surge coming from the river, but you also have rainwater falling. And so in the park, essentially a large stormwater tank was planned where when it rained a lot, instead of trying to get into the river and then being backed up into the buildings, this tank would take a lot of that stormwater with 13 million gallons of capacity. So the engineers were sort of designing this, and when we realized that the tank would actually only be activated when you have the combination of two quite rare events, a 5-year rain event and a 100-year coastal event, and that 99% of the time that tank would be empty, we decided that we really had to think of a way to use this multi-$100 million investment and put it towards better use for that 99% of the time that it wasn't being used. So we looked at its size and its location under the tennis courts. We looked at its location in the community, where it's actually quite well positioned in terms of transit. For those of you who know New York, the East Village is also sort of historically a music destination. And the space is just about on par with some of the major performance venues in New York City. So what we said is, if this is the baseline scheme, where essentially a secant wall is being built, a series of walls are being built to support those really deep secant walls, and then a series of columns are being built with beams, which basically creates this waffle that completely obliterates the space. We said, take that same structure and with a little bit of surcharge in cost, put it into a suspended structure. For the buttresses, have them stepped so that we can actually introduce stairs. For a performance venue of 5,000 people, you need an incredible amount of egress. So we sort of borrowed the Indian stepwell typology to provide the right amount of egress, a series of elevators, submersing the whole thing, but lifting the top to get daylight, and then allowing access up to the tennis courts. this would be the result, a kind of 60-foot deep space, super epic space, which as you approached would have this kind of open and inviting feel. Within, during the day, could be used for public and community events like sports for free. Occasionally could be used for art and culture. But that during the evenings could be used for revenue generating events that could help provide funding to this park, which is a fully publicly right now administrated park and has no private funding of its own, which is sort of in the rest of New York City almost a prerequisite for having a good park. So lest you think we weren't serious, we enlisted some of our favorite engineers to do some guerrilla engineering work and costing work. We calculated that it would be about a 20% increment above the original cost of the tank. We thought about operating structures that could operate such a facility and also calculated what their annual income might be based on the kind of events that would be housed. So this was kind of a fun and exciting foray for us. We actually got a series of musicians in New York City to commit to being on board of such an institution, etc. But as these things sometimes go, it was eventually decided that the tank as an engineering solution would be replaced for cost reasons with sort of incremental improvements over time to the city fabric. And I think in a way our study, which we sort of brought to the attention of some people involved with the project, helped bring attention to the fact that these few $100 million would be going towards at least an infrastructural use, which was only being activated once every several decades. And therefore the cost benefit might not make as much sense. But that aside, with the project on the whole, we are moving ahead. We've just finished construction documents. We'll be going into bidding over the summer. The project is fully funded now with $1.45 billion of city funding, which has supplemented the $335 million, which is a piece of that from HUD. We'll be breaking ground over the summer or fall. And we're super excited to begin that work and to have our bridges lifted over the FDR Drive. So that's ESCR, the first sort of phase. Since 2017, we've also been working on some of the next phases. I'm not going to go into too much depth here, but the phases to the south of ESCR have really been about finding ways to pay for the infrastructure as you build it. So how can you create economic growth that you can then put into the capital costs? So we've been looking at the notion of sort of some level of development, and the city has been looking at this as well, being associated with the flood protection infrastructure, and those studies have been continuing over the last few years. But those are sort of longer term in their scope. So, I would say the Big U really was an interesting learning experience for us in terms of the way that sort of the raw infrastructural needs of the city and what might be seen as headaches or challenges can be turned into opportunities. And that was kind of a more structured competition. And recently in our own neighborhood here in Brooklyn, we kind of did the same thing, but on our own, dealing with the challenge of aging infrastructure, which is something that in America is a huge problem. All of our infrastructure, our highways and our roads were basically built out post-war in the 1950s, and they're all sort of coming to the end of their useful life now. So this is a project called BQP or BQ Park, which deals with Robert Moses again. Robert Moses built East River Park, which we were looking at before, and the FDR Highway, which we were looking at before. And he also built this, the BQE, or Brooklyn Queens Expressway, which runs from the Verrazano Bridge all the way up to the Bronx and runs along my neighborhood here, Brooklyn Heights, as this amazing kind of triple cantilever structure, which is like a bookshelf with sort of 3 lanes on either side, or sorry, on either shelf, and then the Brooklyn Heights Promenade above. It was built in the 1950s, kind of a marvel of engineering. But today, the steel reinforcement inside is corroding. And if nothing is done, cars are basically going to need to be taken off of it within the next 4 to 6 years, and trucks even sooner. It also has one of the most beautiful parks in New York City, the Brooklyn Heights Promenade above. And when this structure was built, actually, I should say, it was the result of a whole lot of community pushback. So Robert Moses originally wanted to build this highway through Brooklyn Heights, the neighborhood itself, which is a super historic and beautiful neighborhood. And the community pushed and pushed, and eventually the concession was that it would be built on the cliffside here with this park built above. So the city came in about a year ago and said, look, we need to repair this thing. And we've looked at the ways to do it, and we only see one viable option that we can build within our public right-of-way footprint. And that is to replace the Brooklyn Heights Promenade, this wonderful park, with a 6-lane highway that would be there for 8 to 10 years, and then eventually be replaced with the park again. And this was really driven by the fact that they were kind of looking within their own right-of-way and were having to deal with this problem urgently. Of course, the community, and we're also part of this community. As I said, I live in Brooklyn Heights. A number of us live in Brooklyn Heights. Our office is in Dumbo, just the next neighborhood over. And so Bjarke asked us to look at what we might do differently. How could we find another way or a better way to do this? So we looked at it and we said, okay, highways all around the country and around the world are being rethought, particularly these kind of immense coastal highways. This is the Embarcadero in San Francisco, pre-1990s, post-1990s. After the Loma Prieta earthquake, it was simply dismantled and traffic was rerouted to surface streets. In New York City, this happened on the West Side Highway, which used to be an elevated viaduct. In the 1970s, a truck crashed through it. The whole thing was dismantled and you ended up with Hudson River Park today. And even if you look just a few years back in Brooklyn Heights in 1874, this illustration is showing the kind of much different waterfront condition that we had, where the city and the water were interlacing much more seamlessly for different purposes here, industry. But as we looked at it, we said, okay, the city's right-of-way basically begins here and ends here. And that's why they've proposed what they've proposed. But if you think a little more comprehensively about this cross-section, what we actually found we could do is build the highway at ground level using a piece of Brooklyn Bridge Park, which today is essentially a berm, which is there to block the noise and the views of the highway, and then a parking strip. So essentially, by building a highway at ground level, we could build it in a super safe manner, deconflicted from existing traffic while the existing highway was running. And then eventually we could build a park on top of that. So increase the amount of public space that we have. And then take the old highway viaduct and repurpose it to public space, or rebuild it in segments and provide additional parking. We looked at the phasing that this would entail, sort of building most of it at ground level, and then working with the pinch points, sort of flipping traffic back and forth, and eventually decking over everything. We put together a pro bono team here. This whole effort was pro bono for a year, where we worked with the landscape architects of Brooklyn Bridge Park to understand what the impacts to Brooklyn Bridge Park would be. So a totally different and more natural kind of cliffside condition, where today you have this infrastructural gulf between the promenade up top and the park below. where you have to walk basically for 20 minutes to get into the park from where we're standing here. You'd have direct connections straight down. A really significant transformation at the ends of the park, where viaduct, which now casts the entrance to the park in shadow, would be completely removed as the highway dives below ground level. And really ending up with what would be probably the most spectacular park in New York City as a result. Integrating as well, I should say, light rail transit and other programs. So putting the pretty picture together was only the start. That took us about 2 months, but we spent the next 7 to 8 months really working through all of the technical issues and preparing a 250-page report describing our approach to each of them, working with our engineering partners who agreed to work with us pro bono as well. So looking at things like, what do we do with existing MTA infrastructure like this electrical substation, meeting with the chief engineers for the MTA, getting their feedback, and then figuring out a technical solution where we can actually build a brace, build a new substation above it, and then build the deck and around it. What do we do about the sewer interceptor that sits below ground? Can it stay? Actually, yes, it probably can stay. Where do the other things go? And what do we do at the pinch points? How can we phase construction in other areas in such a way that's still feasible and that doesn't impact private property? So all of these really nitty-gritty technical issues were super important in terms of sort of convincing powers that be. Also sort of speaking to the impact that a project like this would have, that it's not a project that would be affecting one community, but that actually the Brooklyn waterfront is used by all of Brooklyn. And so in this case, showing a 30-minute walking, biking, and subway shed, and showing really the diversity of the constituency that uses the park. So learning from the Big U and the process there, we hit the pavement and at 1,000+ person town hall meetings, city council hearings, panel discussions with state senators and state assembly members, and other venues, we kind of, just pushed the idea to anyone that would listen. This is the mayor's expert panel that was formed basically after our proposal was put out and DOT's work was sort of put on hold, in large part as a result of our and the community's efforts to really say, look, we want something, we want to think bigger here, we want to think better. And it gained traction. So we got front page arts in the New York Times. We ended up also doing a costing exercise with a cost estimator that reached out to us who wanted to do some work for us pro bono. We figured out that actually this would be cheaper, faster, and more feasible technically than what DOT had proposed. And in February, just before we all went on quarantine, we were met with the great news that City Council and its third-party engineers basically did an independent assessment and determined that ours is one of the only 2 feasible options for this stretch. Ours being sort of the more likely of the 2. So that was super exciting for us. It was fun to do this one really on our own. Now really the community is thinking about, and the city and Corey Johnson here, who's the Speaker of City Council and will be running for mayor next, is really thinking about how we can take that thinking and expand it along the whole corridor, which is all going to be aging and coming offline over the next years. So here's just a little video, I'm hoping that this comes through. Just a little video showing what that transformation would be like. This is where I've been spending my quarantine evenings up here. But here you can see we've taken Furman Street, which runs along, and really integrated it, including a whole bunch of new programs and a new identity for this waterfront. There's a website, bqpark.nyc, that you can visit if you want to share it or want to learn more. There's also a link to the technical report at that website. And, you know, in the kind of post-COVID environment now, this is one of those projects that we think could be a really great candidate for some of the infrastructure spending that that our country is thinking about embarking on as a way of sort of jumpstarting our economy once everyone goes back to work. So more to come, hopefully, on this one. But really, I think an instance where design and, you know, the ability of the designer to make a potential future concrete and really, you know, planted in people's minds as a possible reality comes in really, you know, becomes a really important tool to make change, and one that I think, you know, the world of policy and governance and engineering really hasn't been tapping for the last decades, and that I think they will be, and we, through our own proaction, can sort of push over the next decades. So a third challenge for New York City that is incredibly apparent now with COVID is overcrowding. I'm going to share with you here a competition entry that we recently completed, which we should be hearing back on soon. But sort of an early share here for a really iconic piece of Brooklyn and New York City infrastructure, the Brooklyn Bridge, and what its future might be. So the story of the Brooklyn Bridge really starts, and our concept here of Back to the Future really starts with the bridge at its inception, where public transit was actually a huge component of the bridge. So if you look at its cross section in the 1900s, you had one lane on either direction for horse carriages, which was the predecessor to the private car. But then you had hundreds of streetcars crossing every day, carrying hundreds of thousands of passengers. And then heavy rail. So the sort of predecessor to the subway, the IRT, was running over it as well. Our good friend, let's see, is this? Our good friend Robert Moses in the 1950s, again, together with the rest of the country, really decided that it was the time to disinvest in public transit and invest in private car infrastructure. So the amazing streetcar terminals that sat at either end of the bridge were demolished post-war in the 1950s. And you ended up with 3 lanes of cars on either direction. What that meant from a traffic point of view, this is a super fascinating chart that was put together by Sam Schwartz, his name is also Gridlock Sam. He coined the term gridlock, and he's sort of like a classic New York City traffic figure. But he basically did an analysis of the amount of throughput in terms of person crossings, the amount of people that would cross every day on all of the cross East River bridges at their opening, at their peak year, and then in 1989. So just to take the Brooklyn Bridge, at its peak, when it had streetcars, subway, pedestrians, and horse carriages, it was carrying 426,000 people across it every day. 40 years later or so, with 6 lanes of cars, it was carrying 178,000 people. So less than half, despite a growing city population. And today that number has gone down even more. So you have about 130,000 person crossings a day today. So what that means is that the bridge has become really good at carrying cars, but really bad at carrying people. And if any of you have come to New York on holiday, You'll know that the bridge, while it's a spectacular sight, is becoming almost impossible to use even as a tourist, and downright impossible to use if you live in New York, if you want to use it for commuting or any other reason. Ominously, 1 week into the opening of the bridge, 12 people were killed in the Brooklyn Bridge stampede. And so the city has recently been thinking about what to do about this. And one of the first proposals, the only thing that has been put forward so far, is to look at widening that upper promenade. And so the city council speaker, Corey Johnson, basically said, look, we want to see what else we can do here. And the way we approached it was, yes, you can widen the bridge and that'll help a little bit, but we think that there's an opportunity here for something that would really be a bigger statement and a bigger impact on the city. So, well, those of you who have seen Cuomo's COVID briefings are familiar with this PowerPoint template, but Cuomo and the city recently, over the last year, have basically passed the first instance of congestion pricing in the city, where you will essentially now have to pay to enter New York City by car. The city today is the victim of what's called toll shopping, where the bridges that you see here in red are all tolled, meaning you have to pay for them. But due to sort of arbitrary historic reasons, the three cross river bridges here, the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, and the Williamsburg Bridge, are all free. So that means that if somebody is trying to get from Brooklyn to New Jersey, rather than take the tunnel, the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel straight to the Holland Tunnel, or rather than take the Verrazano Bridge, they actually go out of their way to go deep into Brooklyn and deep into Manhattan to avoid that second toll, which means that a huge amount of traffic going over the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge today and the Williamsburg Bridge shouldn't be there. It should actually be going around the city, which means that capacity will be freeing up on them. So together with our engineers, we looked at the capacity of all of the adjacent bridges. The Manhattan Bridge has 5 inbound lanes and carries 3,000 cars an hour, while the Brooklyn Bridge has 3 inbound lanes and carries 3,800. So the Manhattan Bridge is under capacity. The Hugh L. Carey Tunnel here is under capacity. And what we basically said is, what if, because the Brooklyn Bridge is such an iconic destination for visitors to New York and because it's so beloved by New Yorkers, what if we really turn the Brooklyn Bridge over to people and biking and other forms of transit? Where would the cars that are on it today go? So we actually did a traffic analysis, and we found that 30% of the cars that are going over the Brooklyn Bridge today could be reduced due to congestion pricing. 10% could shift to the Manhattan Bridge, 10% could shift to the Williamsburg Bridge due to their excess capacity, 20% could shift to the Hugh L. Carey Tunnel here, and the other 30% could shift to subways. This is a hugely densely connected set of neighborhoods by subway, and then all the additional mass transit and bikes, which we could then put on the bridge with cars off of it. So this kind of shows you that same mode shift here. Towards walking, biking, e-mobility, which as many of you know is now allowing people to go faster with less hassle via bikes, as well as some form of public transit. And if we were to do this, we'd be creating sort of a dedicated corridor that would link downtown New York City and Manhattan and its City Hall, which is here, to downtown Brooklyn and its City Hall and its downtown. These two downtowns are both growing at a really rapid rate. So if the bridges were originally, or if the bridge was originally uniting these two cities, we could really reunite them in the 21st century. In terms of the cross-section itself, this is what you have today. People and bikes share a super dangerous and crowded corridor up here while cars are running below. And so towards the south and towards the harbor views, we're proposing to shut down all cars and transition it into a pedestrian plaza. In the short term, that could be done by simply taking cars off. no new infrastructure would need to be built. But over time, decking and stairways and rampways could be built linking the upper promenade to the lower promenade. On the northern side, which is typically more in shadow, you would have space for a biking kind of superhighway, so that New Yorkers can actually benefit from the Brooklyn Bridge and not just our visitors from abroad. But also, we would have enough corridor for some kind of a dedicated mass transit high capacity route. So we've been looking at different options for what that would be. In the short term, it could be simple select bus service. Over the long term, it could be autonomous group rapid transit of the type that we've been looking at with Toyota. Or it could be a more traditional fixed rail like the streetcar that's being planned for Brooklyn. All of these sort of have to work with the structural capacity of the bridge, which is already at capacity today at 100%. So we can't really widen the pathway in any significant way because our live loads will just go crazy. This means that essentially we have to have no new space, but really just reprogram it. Looking at some of those possibilities from, can be super flexible, from urban gallery to sort of food destinations, sports events, cultural events, etc. And if you do this, if you take cars off of this bridge, you also end up with a huge amount of Robert Moses 1950s vehicular infrastructure, which can be completely rethought. So on the Manhattan and Brooklyn sides, whereas the bridge anchorages used to be these really civic amazing moments, what they are now are complete barriers. And so what we're looking at here are all of the rampways that could be removed if cars are taken off the bridge, all of the public space that we would win back, in this case 32 acres of public land on both sides, which would be about 5 times the total area of the High Line. And a really dramatic transformation that, is really also in itself an act of historic preservation, where we're really trying to avoid design, but really strip away elements and through programming and circulation, redefine these spaces. On the Dumbo side, sort of similar thinking. This is our office over here. But there are city-owned facilities underneath the bridge which are disused and which right now are serving no purpose except to block the neighborhood from the waterfront. So again, thinking about making connections to the waterfront stronger as we rethink our infrastructure here rather than weaker. So this proposal was sort of developed in response to the overcrowding of tourists and New Yorkers on the bridge. Since we actually submitted this, the world has been changing, as we know. Actually, an ex-Big Stir, Melody Harvey, has been mapping all the sidewalk widths in New York and really showing the areas that are difficult to traverse and to practice social distancing in well. So the city has started in a very cautious way to begin shutting streets down and opening them up to people. Just from a bike ride I took over the weekend on one of these closed streets, where you really have a different vision of New York City. You hear birds chirping, right? You have kids playing, people walking their dogs. So I think what we're excited about now is taking that thinking, which originally we were really thinking about for the Brooklyn Bridge, and expanding it and really sort of combining the efforts of the city to build towards a network that can host bikes and walking routes for people to move around safely in the city, both during the recovery for COVID, but also beyond COVID, and start to create a beyond COVID city, which is more about nature and more about people. So just about running up on time, but I want to end here with kind of a bonus project that's on the boards right now. It's actually, we're still in the middle of it. But, I think through all these projects in New York City, dealing with different issues, dealing with different sectors of the government, from mobility to environmental to economic development, et cetera, we've sort of been growing our fluency in all of these different areas of city building. And so this next project kind of represents a kind of project that's really exciting for us, and that I think I really hope we're gonna get to do more of over the coming years, which is helping cities that have a fresh start and that can sort of start from scratch, think about all these systems together in a more holistic way. So we were invited by the state of Atlántico in Colombia and the city of Barranquilla to look at the growth of their city. Barranquilla here, it's a bit like New York City in the sense that it lies at the super strategic position at the mouth of the biggest river in Colombia, the equivalent of the Hudson River in New York, the Rio Magdalena, and the Caribbean Ocean here. It's today the fourth largest city in Colombia, behind Medellin, Bogota, Cali. But historically, it's been sort of the gateway to the Caribbean and to the Americas. And its sort of nickname is the Puerta de Oro, the Golden Gate, the Golden Door. So this state is basically mostly concentrated in terms of population at this mouth of the river and harbor. And when it first started, it was actually the second largest city in Colombia, and really an innovative city of firsts, a lot like New York City, where it benefited from a huge influx of immigrants, Middle Eastern, even Jewish immigrants. It had the first airport in the Americas, the longest pier in the world, and was really kind of the gateway to South America. Over the course of the 20th century, the city really turned inwards due to the domestic unrest in the country, and sort of halted its growth. And interestingly, during this period, we've been working with the NYU Marin Institute for Urban Studies, and there's this phenomenon called the invisible wall, where, show you here, the city sort of grew steadily, but from this whole period through the 50s to the 90s, even though the population of the city was growing, the physical boundaries of the city really didn't grow very much because people were really clustering and concentrating within city limits for security. But essentially what's been starting to happen is through the 90s, you've started to have explosive growth as the security situation and the political situation in the country improves. The sort of drive to expand and to suburbanize is becoming stronger and stronger. A ring road has basically been built here, and the sort of fear now is that this whole area will be filled in with ad hoc development without a plan in place. So the governor of this state and the mayor of Barranquilla came to us and asked if we could put together a plan that would look at this area, and this is the second ring road that was built. The city is actually out here. So really an incredible amount of territory to be dealing with, but all privately owned. So if nothing is done, this is actually what will happen. Development will happen in an ad hoc manner, and you will end up with sprawl. So we've been working with the governor, sort of exploring the place pre-COVID, sort of air, land, and sea, and again, sort of trying to understand what the aspirations of the different communities that sit along this expansion ring are. This could be a whole lecture in itself, this project, but just to kind of give you some of the highlights and where we're going with it. We're being asked to look at this really comprehensively, both planning, regulations, economic development, industry, commerce, and agriculture. what's the future of tourism, of the provision of affordable housing, public realm, mobility, of course, stormwater infrastructure, environment, importantly, and what are the scales of intervention from the house and the street, the neighborhood, the sort of small town to Gran Barranquilla and the region that it sits in and its connections to places like Cartagena and Santa Maria and Bogota. So the kind of framework that we're developing here begins with environmental restoration and preservation as a framework. So we've been working with the local university to understand what the most sensitive areas are ecologically and what the ones are that should be preserved. And we sort of arrived at this map or figure. So we then sort of formalized these areas into this kind of green banana, a green and blue creek shed here, and then a series of parks that would sort of define a series of central parks between the old city and the new city in the future. We then connect this sort of more wild green banana here to these smaller, more civically oriented parks with wildlife corridors, ending up with this sort of zigzag of public space, which then becomes a definition of the boundaries of growth. Water becomes really important here. So what we're actually proposing is in an area that's going to be increasingly dry, this whole valley, taking the Rio Magdalena and actually rerouting it through our new areas and then discharging it out into the Caribbean so that we can irrigate this whole area that's going to be housing about 1 million people over the next 50 to 100 years. So there's sort of a major piece of green infrastructure, green weave, a major piece of blue infrastructure, which we call the Canal Leon, and then a major piece of gray infrastructure. So today, if you're trying to get from any of these small townships out here to the center of the city, it takes anywhere from 2 to 3 hours with the existing bus networks. So from a mobility point of view, working with our mobility engineers, we sort of arrived at the notion of a loop as the most efficient way to link the new territories to the old territories, where on a dedicated right-of-way, with a system that would sort of avoid conflicts by going under them or over them to keep speed, you can actually get from any point in the city to any other point within 45 minutes, which would be an enormous boost in terms of access to jobs, access to services, and the kind of economic growth of the city. So again, this is some sort of in progress stuff, but kind of working with the notion of the transit-oriented development as a unit of growth, sort of 10-minute walking radius, which defines the width of these fingers and islands, and then defining and sort of working with programming in these new fingers and islands to build off of the characters and existing industries that we have already building in these areas of the expansion zone, and sort of having a mix where the fingers can be developed maybe a little more traditionally and incrementally, but these islands can be sort of testing grounds for future urbanism and also governance. So sort of a tour from the north to the south with this weave of green and blue and gray. And then a few of these kind of spaces that we're creating. The green ring, the blue ring, and then kind of the gray ring, both working with the existing waterfront, but also serving at the stations to define areas of density for new growth. And in the end, you know, we thought this might be best expressed through a kind of day in the life where there's a start in high quality housing somewhere in the expansion zone, sort of neighborhood plazas with bike share are associated with schools and daycares and drop-off. People can move around safely on dedicated bike paths, make their way to the ELO or the thread, this kind of this ring around the city. And in 20 minutes or so, get to any other neighborhood and place of work. So this has been sort of a really fun and interesting exploration for us. We look forward to working with these guys more. I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to open it up to questions. Realize I'm not leaving you with a closing graphic, really, but I think what all these projects kind of demonstrate is that as designers, there's a lot that we can do today. There's a lot of issues out there, and there are a lot of institutions and governments and communities that are looking for smart thinking at all kinds of scales, and that don't know how to do it. So I think it's really an interesting moment for the design disciplines. I hope to see this work growing in our practice. I know it is already, and I think for the field at large, it's going to be a big part of our future. Thanks. Okay, so I am taking a look at questions. Anastasia, and give me a second. Please ask any and all questions. Okay. So the first question is two questions. One, as you have mentioned, New York Island has an enormous amount of communities and groups which are involved in neighborhood activities, which to a certain degree have independency on the decision making. Could you elaborate on the most challenging aspect of those communication processes and participatory meetings between the existing communities in order to agree on the strategic principles? And then a second question, which is I think related to that, is what types of tools and instruments have you incorporated, introduced in order to engage the community in the design process? Okay. So I'll start with the challenges. Look, I mean, in a city like New York City, any large city, just the number of voices is a challenge to begin with. It's a lot of time, and it's a lot of energy that we spend building those relationships and having those conversations. It's hugely important. It's critical to the work. We can't do it without it. But it means that we have to staff our projects differently. We need to allow for that focus and that time in our teams and in our scopes. So that's kind of on the office side. In terms of content, let's say, I think trust is always a challenge. There's a history of in a lot of the neighborhoods we work in of a real lack of trust between government and community. There's been a lot of neglect and disinvestment over the last decades. I think our government is getting better and is really, in New York City at least, is genuinely dedicated to doing the right thing and making these neighborhoods better, the ones that haven't seen as much investment. But I think just convincing people that your intentions are good and that you're on the same team takes a little bit. And I think that the way that we do that is being extremely open, as I've said, and transparent about what we're doing, and not waiting until the last minute when we have our fully baked idea to share it, but really bringing people in early and showing them early options and talking about pros and cons. So I think that kind of speaks to the second point, which are tools. And yeah, I mean, I would say tools are, models, clear iterations, options, and just a transparent and open process. I think you also have to be open with people about what you can and can't solve. In a lot of places, policy questions like displacement and gentrification come up. For example, this has come up on the Lower East Side. When we first began working with Lower East Side Ready, they said, look, we're not sure we want you here because if you build us this amazing park, our property values are going to go up and we're going to be kicked out of here and we're not going to be able to enjoy our neighborhood. And we said, you're right, that's a huge issue. And you should keep working with New York City government and with your elected officials to make sure that that doesn't happen. At the same time, I think we both agree that this neighborhood needs to be protected. And if it's protected, we don't want to build a wall that's going to cut your families off from the waterfront, but we want to create a park that's going to be a great thing for everyone who lives here. And so once you arrive at those two common points, that's the point that design can get to. And then it takes us and the community and others continuing to push on really the political system to address challenges that are outside of that scope. Okay. I'll move to the next question. Could you please briefly explain the funding for such types of projects, both analysis and development and implementation? Are they usually financed from city development budgets, IFIs, or any other sources? What's an IFI? Is that like a PPP? Maybe Anna. Oh yeah. Yes. Okay, got it. Right. So it's a mix. I would say that what you have after an event like Hurricane Sandy is a huge influx of public money, because the way that we fund our public infrastructure in America is when it's about to collapse or when it has already collapsed, billions of dollars are made available by Congress as part of disaster recovery. However, long-term maintenance and upkeep and regular capital improvements in the States are something that as a society we have sort of disinvested in over the last decades. And I'm really hoping that over the next decades, we're going to begin to challenge that logic, because over time, you just end up spending more money on this disaster Band-Aid recovery than on sensible long-term capital improvement. So the first phases of the Big U are fully publicly funded. However, the future phases of the Big U, everybody recognizes that there are going to have to be public-private partnerships and revenue capture in order to make sure that they can be built. Same with something like the Brooklyn Bridge. I think we're going to be looking at, first of all, what are the cheapest and highest impact things we can do? Almost the entirety of the Brooklyn Bridge proposal that I showed can be built basically without, or it can be accomplished without building any new infrastructure. It's simply taking cars off the road, putting some paint down on the ground, and opening it up to people and bikes and buses. So, that's another strategy, sort of low cost, high impact. And then the other is in a situation like Barranquilla, where the government is really wanting to get out ahead of private development. Of course, it's going to work with private developers, but there's really more of a hand-in-hand sort of traditional, combination of the two. The last project is the BQE, and that's one that's going to cost a few $1 billion. The funding is going to come likely from a combination of city, state, and federal, I would think, in the end. And that's a reason that those levels really need to work with each other. Because part of the reason that no progress has been made up until now is a lack of coordination between those levels of government, and really a dysfunction in some ways with that coordination, which leads both to a shortfall of funding, but also to a lack of possibility in terms of design options, which is why DOT put out its original proposal and why it took us, an outside entity, to question it. Okay, next question is, given the scales that you work with, what programs do you use to take the concept design through construction documentation? Yeah, so for East Side Coastal Resiliency, it's been pretty traditional. We've been doing, concept and schematic design in all the typical stuff we normally use. We're an office that's heavy on Rhino and Adobe Suite, basically. But then as we get to construction documentation, it's really been CAD. And it's been sort of more traditionally coordinated by the engineering project manager. I mean, it's an immense set. It's thousands and thousands and thousands of sheets. It's something like 15 firms framing into it. I'm sure more than 1,000 people have been working on the documentation and design of the East Side project. But the world of infrastructure, I've been finding, is a little bit behind the world of architecture in terms of some of the technology it's using. So sort of Revit and BIM and some of these smarter programs haven't really found their way yet into that work, as far as I can tell. So the next question is, wondering how much of the projects in New York City, or broadly speaking in the US, changed moving from the Obama administration to Trump's administration. So, I would say the scale at which these projects operate, both in terms of size and time, means that there's a bit of a lag. So right now in New York City, for example, a lot of the parks that are being completed, like Governor's Island, Brooklyn Bridge Park, Roosevelt Island, et cetera, are actually from the Bloomberg administration, which is, 6 years ago by now. So, the Big U, for example, came out of an Obama initiative, and 5 or 6 years later, that's still trickling down. We haven't seen the pulling back of any of the funding for the projects we're working on in terms of federal funding by the Trump administration. I don't think that's not really any kind of expectation right now. These projects are fully funded by HUD. I think we'll probably be seeing the impacts of funding, federal funding, in the next 5 years. We'll probably be seeing the ripples. But I think we also see that infrastructure is something that both parties see the value in. There was a lot of talk of it at the beginning of Trump's administration that infrastructure could be a bipartisan issue and a whole lot of investment could go into it. That didn't happen. But we are hoping that the COVID situation might kind of shake that loose and provide almost a New Deal 2.0 for the US. If anyone's not familiar with the New Deal was a Franklin Roosevelt initiative after the Great Depression, the closest example we have to what we're going through now, in the 30s, which basically put millions of people back to work through building incredible infrastructure, highways, the Hoover Dam, the gymnasium at the high school that I went to, national parks, and that more than just building sort of necessary infrastructure, there was really kind of a civic pride and a national pride baked into all of the projects, and sort of civic quality, and creating something that Americans could be proud of. So I'm really hoping that we can get to something like that, either at the scale of the country or at least on a state-by-state level here in the next months and years. What would Bigster Jeremy of now tell just about to graduate Jeremy that would be vital for his future? Oh boy. Let me think about that. I think, this is something that happens like as you as you grow, like I think at each stage of growth, you come to this realization in some way or another. But I came to this realization maybe 5 years into sort of being an adult and working in New York. But I think when I was just graduating, I still had this sense that somehow people know what they're doing out there, that, you know, government knows what it's doing, engineers know what they're doing, elected officials know what they're doing. And, you know, if you had told me that we, even as designers or as big, could meaningfully intervene in these kinds of situations, I would be doubtful that that would be the case. But you know, I've been learning more and more that people don't really know what they're doing, and if you have a clear idea and you're convinced in it, and you can back it up with rigor, just the fact that no one has put that idea out there doesn't mean it's a bad idea. To the contrary, it's probably stupid reasons that the idea hasn't been put out there yet. For example, the BQ Park proposal, I think, you know, if I'm just looking at it, it's like the most obvious thing you could possibly imagine to do. You build it at ground level and you put a park over it, but somehow years of development of that project and nobody came out and said that. So that's what I would tell myself then, and that's what I would tell, you know, any graduates now is you're smarter than you think. and you can really have a voice in these kind of situations. Okay, the next is, it seems that you tend to rethink and challenge the existing conditions, proposals in your projects. What are the tools you use to convince the authorities in your new visions? Yeah, I mean, I guess just to summarize some of the things that I touched on in the talk, I would say one, you know, vision. So literally vision, like compelling visuals are something that we can produce that nobody else really can. Putting somebody in that future and making them feel that it's there and it's real and it's possible. That's a clear one. But I would say that we spend a lot of time on the back end looking at cost implications, working with engineers to understand the technical implications of things, understanding what the concerns of our clients are, both in government and also community. Government is hugely concerned with maintenance and operations in anything that they build. Capital cost is usually almost the least critical thing. It's more, you know, they want to know how many people is it going to take to maintain this new park? Like how often is this fencing chain link going to need to be replaced? How often is this thing going to need to be repainted? And so we try to speak to all those concerns in what we do. To that end, like I even, you know, I went for the planning accreditation, which is normally geared towards our government clients and those kinds of people, just to kind of really understand where they're coming from. And, you know, I think it's about speaking a series of different languages, and being able to communicate an idea differently to different audiences. One thing I find often is that my tone and my remarks will change a lot based on who I'm speaking with, and what they want to know or what their concerns are with a particular project. I would also say that a key tool in convincing an authority, like a government entity, is demonstrating community support. That's critical. That's why Rebuild by Design was so successful. Is before the money was given to the city governments, the Rebuild by Design organization made sure that the teams worked directly with community members, built relationships with the community, and had those later when the city took on the administration of these projects. Okay, that's it.